you spent time in Paris for a long time, didn't you, Antonio? Or
I lived in Paris for about 5.5 months, writing after school. I was living in the area of Paris that we ultimately would shoot in, which was right beside Pigalle, and I lived on this beautiful, picturesque street called Rue de Martyrs, and if you go down one side street, you go to Victor Mass, and then it was very strange because it would just it would lead you up to Pigalle, and it was peppered with all these hostess bars, and I loved that area because it reminded me of this romanticized idea of New York in the 70s or Times Square in the 70s or something, and so there was something so alluring about it, but also quite scary. I mean, it's not necessarily the area you want to walk around at night, but there is this kind of the lights and the sound and everything just kind of alive in a way, and so when this idea, it was always conceived as an idea to take place in Paris. It was never anywhere else it could be.
In terms of portraying environment, I mean, to make environment another character in the film, is that difficult to gauge if you're being successful at that or not?
I knew that I was going to sort of create an anti-iconic Paris, and I knew that that we would shoot landmarks almost in the same way we shot parents in after school or adults in after school. They're always sort of in the periphery or sort of obstructed or cut off, and so by making that choice, you give it a definitive quality. On the other side, if we decided we wanted to create the postcard Paris, well, that would be a character in itself as well. It just would be the postcard version of the city. So we were going very much the anti-postcard version of the city. You could make a postcard out of anything we shot.
Well, what fascinates me about the movie also, and Brady, your performance plays right into to this, is the fact that it's one of those movies that I love, the type that does not ingratiate itself to an audience. So, and I'm sure that you're faced with people saying, well, is this a sympathetic character and blah blah blah, as if that's the most important consideration. But
I don't think I was ever in search of an audience's sympathy. I don't even think I was in search of an audience's understanding. I was only thinking about. I felt like my only obligation was to try and keep the character compelling, and if the character suddenly felt like it was difficult to gauge at times how charismatic he should be, just for the sake of holding an audience's attention for 105 minutes. But I don't. I've never been overly concerned about how somebody feels about a character. I mean, it's especially with a film like this. It's like people are supposed to feel conflicted. I mean, it's supposed to give them something to wrestle with. The whole movie is a movie that's meant to be wrestled with. And so I mean, luckily, it's funny. I think about it like. I think part of the reason that I loved cinema so much growing up, or really loved difficult cinema, and cinema that sort of demanded a little special attention, was because I grew up listening to a lot of hardcore and punk, and I love punk music, and I remember films that I felt like, in a way, were kind of films that were incredibly subversive, films that for me in one way or another were kind of punk, and so I feel like I've always been interested in things that are on the fringe, and that's something that's just a matter of taste. I'm interested in pushing boundaries. I'm interested in pushing those boundaries within myself. you know, this is just a medium that I've chosen to experiment with.
I love films like that too. I mean, but it seems like the climate in movies for a while has been for a movie to do the work for an audience. So I mean, they don't necessarily have to bring anything to the movie because it tells them exactly how they're supposed to feel.
It's a homogenized era of cinema, and I'll tell you what's really bad. What's really, really bad are the in-between films, like the movies that are bridging art films and Hollywood. It's like, see, you can be artful and you can reach, you know, a mass audience. And I feel like when anybody is thinking about how many people they're going to reach, they're preoccupied with the wrong thing. Like, they should only be preoccupied with the truth of the story that they're telling, and then the fact that so many films are made by committee, naturally makes, you know, most films and art in general just kind of watered down. And the truth of the matter is that, you know, when you make a film like this, for as much praise as we've received from certain people, we've also taken a hell of a lot of abuse. So it's kind of a thing where you have to really, make sure that you're up for it. And because and Antonio, myself, and Maddie, our lead actress, I mean, we're all pretty sensitive people, and we do care. Like, we did make a movie for people to see. And we do hope that in a way, of course, that they enjoy it, or that they're compelled by it, or that they're fascinated by it, or that they have an experience. So it's always painful, you know, for just a moment when somebody is very dismissive. But on the other hand, it's kind of, you know, everything I've ever liked in my entire life has always been divisive. I mean, I mean. I mean, it's like look at Christoph Penderecki or anything like this, where it's just like people didn't know what to do with that for a while. It's just like, oh my God, it's just noise. And then, you know, at a certain point, people found the poetry in it.
What I really find fascinating, and a movie like yours really brings this out. You've talked about the divisive kind of reaction to it. Some people love it, some people are infuriated by it, but their reaction says a lot more about them than the actual movie a lot of times.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I find that there's those reviews that aren't reviews, but reactions, and they're like their gut quick reactions to the movie. And what's interesting about them is that they seem like very visceral reactions, and they're very angry about the movie. But I think it's an anger that stems from some sort of connection they've made with the story or the character that they don't want to make, or, you know, that they feel uncomfortable about. The really uncomfortable thing about Simon is that I don't think he is that. I think he gets to a place that you can say, well, that's not where I am. You know, I would never go there. But what's crazy about him is that there is a great deal about him that's incredibly accessible and relatable as a young man, and as a young woman who's been in relationships with men like this. It's scary as well. And so I think that there's something about Simon that's discomforting, but not because he's from another place or another world, or someone they can never imagine, but someone that they can point out in their own life, or they can they can point to in someone else's life.
I agree with you.
They can see in themselves, you know.
Well, just last week I was talking to the editor, Bob Fosse's editor, and we're talking about Star 80. Star 80 we were talking about, and I said, oh my God, I love Star 80. And I said, I think a big reason why people were so vehement against that film when it came out was because it forced them to relate to someone they would have much preferred to look upon as a monster, in the Eric Roberts character. And movies should challenge us like that. They should open up our perspective of humanity, I think.
I love that you bring up Bob Fosse. I die for Bob Fosse.
Oh yeah, me too.
I mean, I feel like I feel like Bob Fosse and Frederick Weissman are like the greatest Americans, greatest American filmmakers of all time.
I feel like we get this question a lot, which is interesting. It's like, why would you make a movie about such a horrible person? And the response is always like, why wouldn't we? I mean, what is the criteria for making it for certain, telling a story? It's that there's some sort of, that you have to have redemption and that you have to tell a story about someone good or someone likable. It's just kind of absurd that there's this idea of what a story is and what a story isn't, or what a character is and what a character isn't. And it's interesting. It's like people don't necessarily they don't get mad that Simon is a false character, but more that it's a character from real life that they'd rather not see. And so it's interesting to know that people, even the people that don't like the film, see the film for what it is and see Simon for what he is, and are affected by him in some way, but they like don't want to be reminded that guy exists in a way.
I had a question about another aspect of the film that I think is incredibly brave and very insightful, and that is the sexual content of the film. The way films portray sex is always a fascinating topic to me, because most films that involve sex don't have anything to do with sex, because the sex in the movie doesn't explain who their characters are. But I found that in your film, sex was an expression of character, much like a Last Tango in Paris or something of that ilk. Tell me how you guys built those scenes, and Brady, how it reflected who Simon was.
I mean, we always spoke from the very beginning about tracking the character's sort of arc through the character's sexual experience. Because here's the thing, like, the character, for the most part, every scene in the film is an isolated instance. I mean, an isolated instance. Like, I don't believe that the character has much of an arc until the third act. I feel like for the most part, he's, he believes the lies that he's telling. Whatever he's saying at that moment is true for him right then, because he's constantly rewriting his history. The one place where we were trying to build a little bit more of an arc, though, was through the physicality, because you see in the very first time that I'm with Maddie, that the very first sex scene is in fact not we don't actually have sex. The character seems incapable of physically relating to her. He just makes her turn around and jerks off, comes, and it's over. And then you see a really slow progression of him being drawn in, and it seems like maybe in a way, just because then the next time they're having sex, she's bent over, but so he's still not looking at her. But then and then it slowly starts to evolve into something that could almost be romantic, and then there's a shift in the dynamic, and she sort of starts to take control. And then at that point, and even when she takes control, I seem to enjoy it a little bit. But then ultimately, maybe it seems as if I resent it, and I move on. So it's the one place in the story where I think that there's a great deal of clarity, and that was something that was incredibly important to Antonio. And it was something that the three of us discussed at length, psychologically, where these characters were and what each scene meant.
I have time for one more question with you guys, and I wanted to ask about the pace of the film, because it feels very transfixing and hypnotic and very patient in a way, the pacing of the film, starting with that gorgeous slow pan out during your opening monologue, Brady. So Antonio, is it always a challenge to kind of calibrate the pace of a film in the editing phase? Was that a big consideration for you?
Yeah, you're aware of the pacing you're setting sort of, or that you're setting yourself up for. You know, you're locking yourself into a certain kind of rhythm, and so you need to make the decision early on. And once you embrace it, you know, you find it as you're shooting. You know, what scenes can move a little faster, what scenes don't necessarily move faster. But the sort of approach that I've taken to editing on these two films was very much of when does the scene start and when does it end? And that could end, you know, in the middle of a sentence, or that could end at this one last beat that suggests something about the story. Whatever it is, there's a definitive sort of beginning and end to a shot and to a scene, and there's no qualm with abruptly cutting it, and that creates a certain kind of a pace and a visceral response. But I think it can be jolting, especially if you're lulled into the quietness of a long take. But it is all about it. It all becomes a very big, tricky thing in editing to make sure that you're not going too fast in one shot. And, you know, if you go too fast in one shot, then it affects the next shot. And so it's a very delicate balance you have to try and find. And then, you know, do you punctuate it with this other shot? Because the film does go from like a long shot to, you know, a static close up or a static shot somewhere where we get a big loud music cue, and so, you know, leave that running for 5 seconds or 10 seconds. Then, you know, you get into a matter of seconds, you get in a matter of frames. It's a very delicate balance, and you know, the audience, you try to set up a language that sort of uses your audience into it, and sometimes that works for people and sometimes it doesn't. I think the long take can become a challenge for some people because they're so unused to it. But I find that the long take is a very meditative and more pleasant way to watch a movie sometimes, because of the fact that you can just sink into a movie easier, in my opinion.
I agree.
What I find so funny about that is, like, I've been watching a lot of older films, and I was watching Henry V with Laurence Olivier, and I just had this. It's amazing how there wasn't a question of like, a long take or a short take. Some takes would go on forever in old movies, you know, and it seems like now there's more of a thing about it, and so people just kind of go to the extreme with it, or, you know, one way or the other. But, you know, classic cinema relied on long takes. You know, there was much more of a theatrical element to them that I think we've lost sight of. And you know, for me, the greatest benefit of that is that your actors get to sink into the role, into the moment, into the scene so much more seamlessly and effortlessly than if they're cutting around them and you're covering the scene the way that you normally cover it.